Chapter 45 The Friend. It was March 1st, 1830. At Schönbrunn, the Duke of Reichstadt, before a solemn board of examiners, was taking a final examination to round off his studies. His grandfather and the Empress had made a point of being present at this completion of his course. In reply to questions about the code of military regulations, the Duke was answering fluently. All at once the Emperor pricked up his ears. "Why are the church bells ringing at this time of day?" he asked. "Oh, it's an alarm signal," cried the Empress. She turned pale. Almost immediately, the sound of guns thundered in the air. The people present stared at one another, seized with sudden anxiety. "What does this mean?" asked Francis. At this moment, a breathless officer entered the room. "Sire," he gasped, "the Danube has burst its banks. Bridges and embankments have been carried away. Already the suburbs are flooded. The alarm has been given." He added that masses of ice, borne by the current, were knocking down the walls of houses. A number of people had been drowned. The Emperor stood up. "Come on," he said. "We must organize rescue work." "I'll come with you," said the Duke. Francis glanced at his grandson and shook his head. "You mustn't dream of such a thing in your present state of health, Franz." "But, grandfather, I can't stay here when all those poor people are in danger." "Look at yourself in the mirror, my boy. You're as white as a ghost. You've got a cough, and you've no strength. Stadenheim has forbidden your dancing and fencing. How can you face icy water?" "It would be madness on your part, my dear Franz," said the Empress. "You'd only make yourself worse, without doing anybody any good. Come, be reasonable." Franz hung his head. It hurt him now more than ever not to be treated as a man. He rebelled against the bodily weakness which held him down. "All right," he said, in a low voice. "I won't go, but let me give you all the money I've got. That's the least I can do to relieve the distress." The Duke seemed more or less restored to health when on June 17th he set off for Graz, to Styria, to join the Emperor, the Empress, and his mother, whom he had not even seen since Neperg's death. Marie-Louise had come from Lothbrock. She had traveled from Venice to Trieste by steamer, which was quite an event at the time. As soon as he arrived at Graz, the Duke lost no time in seeing his mother. He found her fleshy, pimply, and doleful. Their expressions of affection lacked spontaneity and enthusiasm. Nevertheless, the Duke made no reference to the past. He stood in too much need of his mother's help to obtain his emancipation and a military household worthy of him. Some days were spent in various ceremonies, religious celebrations, popular festivities, reviews and parades. One day, during a fireworks display, the Duke heard voices shouting behind him, "Long live Napoleon!" But that did not stop him writing in his diary, "The money spent on such displays is sheer waste. It would be much better to save it for charitable purposes, or the founding of some useful institution." On June 20th, just before the Emperor and his guest sat down to table, a young major was introduced to the Duke of Reichstadt. Für Prakash von Osten. Bowing before him, the Duke saw an officer of about 35, somewhat frail in appearance. He had a long, handsome face. His firm lips were clean-shaven. His thick curly hair was parted in the middle. Despite his dark, bushy eyebrows, his face had an expression of great charm. On his side, Prakash was immediately attracted by the Duke's blue eyes, fair hair, and virile brow. His aristocratic good looks made a deep impression on him. "I had a feeling," he wrote later, "similar to that of a young man meeting, for the first time, the girl to whom he will give his heart." They sat down to table. Prakash was placed beside Franz, opposite to the Emperor and the Empress. The Archduke John and other officers were also present. During the meal, the Duke exchanged only a few polite remarks with his neighbor. But after the Empress and the Archduke John had withdrawn, he questioned Prakash about his travels. The major was only too glad to tell him about them. He was a native of Graz, but he had traveled a good deal and discharged various diplomatic duties in the Balkans, Asia Minor, and Egypt. At Smyrna, he had been chief of staff of the Austrian squadron entrusted with suppressing the Barbary pirates in the islands of the archipelago. At the moment he was resident at Athens, and was looking for a king for Greece. The Duke listened to him with intense interest. Prakash had a voice which was mellow, deep, and delightful. The most commonplace sentences, as he spoke them, seemed like evocations of fairyland. His conversation with the Duke lasted 2 hours. When they parted, the Duke shook hands with Prakash and said, with a mysterious smile, "I've known you for a long time." The next morning, when de Tristan visited the Duke, he was accompanied by Prakash in full-dress uniform. The Duke darted towards him with outstretched hands and eyes aglow with delight. "Oh, I'm so glad you thought of coming to see me. I told you last night that I had known you for a long time. I've liked you for a long time too, that's the truth." "Your Highness is too flattering to me," said Prakash. "Not at all. You don't know what a great service you did me. You defended my father's honor at a time when everybody was doing his best to calumniate him. I've read your memoir on the Battle of Waterloo. In order to get it into my mind better, I translated it twice, first into French, and then into Italian." "All I did was bear witness to the truth, Prince," said Prakash. "To belittle Napoleon would have meant diminishing at the same time the merits of those who defeated him. At Waterloo, your father was overwhelmed by circumstances rather than by men. His genius was not at fault. There was the rain, the fatigue of his troops, Grouchy's mistake." At this point, de Tristan intervened. "Come, come, my dear Prakash. Waterloo belongs to the past. Let's talk about the future. Tell the Duke your plans about Greece." They are easily told. I think that a unique opportunity presents itself for Austria to establish her domination in the East and check Russian influence there. Greece is in search of a king. There can be no question of a German prince on account of religion. Why should not Greece offer the throne to an Austrian prince? Prakash paused to give weight to his words, and pointing his finger at the Duke, went on. To your Highness, for example. To me, cried the Duke in astonishment. Are you talking seriously? So seriously that after we parted last night, I spoke to my patron, the Archduke John, and to Colonel Worklean, your mother's minister. The Duke's eyes sparkled. And what did they say? They approved my proposal. Did they really? Indeed, Her Majesty the Empress, who had meanwhile taken part in the conversation, approved of it too. The Empress. Franz was in ecstasies. He did not know how to thank this man, unknown to him the day before, who now offered him a crown as calmly as though it were a modest present to pay his footing. At this moment Prince von Hohenlohe was announced. Prakash stood up, but the Duke signed to him to sit down again. Don't go, he said. The prince won't stay long. I don't want to lose you now. The old general came in, but he soon withdrew, impelled by the Duke's monosyllabic replies. The others resumed their conversation. Prakash turned it to Napoleon. Franz spoke about his father with the greatest enthusiasm. Everything he said expressed ardent admiration and passionate affection. His military genius was unique in history, he declared. Ah, what would I not give to become a great soldier like him? The three of them proceeded to discuss the battles Napoleon had fought, particularly Austerlitz. On this subject the Duke was inexhaustible. He detailed the movements of the opposing armies, as though he had been personally present. The whole lay of the terrain was familiar to him. He knew the names of all the corps commanders, and the strength of all the units. He pointed out the mistakes which had been committed, the daring strokes which had succeeded. Usually calm, he became animated. His hands seemed to be maneuvering the 160,000 men who took part in the battle. He brought it to life again before the eyes of Prakash and Tristan. Prakash stared at him in surprise. In this youth he found a man whom he had never suspected. The scope of the Duke's knowledge of strategy and the sureness of his judgment astonished him. Prince, he said, in all sincerity, I don't believe there is an officer in the whole garrison of Graz better gifted for high command than yourself. The Duke smiled sadly. But what is the good of these gifts with which you are good enough to credit me, Herr von Prakash? How can I turn them to account in the solitude in which I find myself? I am surrounded only by mediocre men, minor statisticians, stuffed shirts, dear old blockheads. What I need is officers with brains and enthusiasm. He glanced furtively at his tutor and went on. My destiny may be none other than to become a Prince Eugene of Austria. But how can I make myself ready for such a role? I am in search of a man capable of initiating me into the higher strategy of war. It is no offense to Count de Tristan to say that I have no such man in my entourage." He paused, and held out his hands to Prokesh. "My friend, if I may call you so, my friend, you are the man for whom I have been waiting. Stay with me, sacrifice your career for me. I feel that we were made to understand each other." Prokesh felt the warmth, the sincerity of his outburst. It affected him deeply. He was at a loss what to say. "Prince," he said, "you overestimate my merits. I should be afraid of disappointing you. I am no soldier, but simply a diplomat and a traveler. You are a great strategist. Don't deny it. Your writings prove it. Didn't I tell you that your Life of Prince Schwarzenberg served me as a model in my studies? We must read your account of the Battle of Waterloo over again together. We can talk about what I have just suggested to you some other time, but I'm sure you won't refuse to help me." Prokesh stood up. "Permit me to withdraw, Prince. I must go and call upon your mother at the Villa Mondel." The Duke accompanied him to the door, with one hand on his shoulder. Henceforth the two of them met almost every day. De Tristan felt that Prokesh would have a good influence over his pupil, and he encouraged their friendship. Franz was as enraptured as a youth in love for the first time. Since Prokesh had come into his life, he felt as though a great stretch of one of the walls of his prison had fallen down. Through the breach he could see the unconfined sky, the world with all its freedom, dreams which he had only to stretch out his hand to turn into realities. He had found somebody who could understand him, somebody in whom he could confide, a man whom he could esteem and love. Prokesh, his senior by 16 years, was not only a friend, but also a far-seeing guide, a kind of elder brother with an unselfish soul, whose advice and even reproach he could accept without injury to his proper pride. His heart drank deep of the cup of friendship. It was not yet 8 o'clock on June 28th when Prokesh presented himself at the Duke's. He found Franz in riding kit, just going out. The Duke promptly gave up his ride and led his friend into his room. De Tristan was there, but he soon left them alone together. "Has your Highness reflected," asked Prokesh, "about what I said to you the other day, on the subject of the throne of Greece?" "I don't say no," replied the Duke, "but am I not a year or so too young to become king of that country? I should have to have a regent. Perhaps it would be better for me to wait." "If you do," said Prokesh, "take advantage of the respite to make yourself ready for the great role to which you are destined. Above all, read the story of Napoleon's life. He foresaw the present state of affairs with implacable logic. You could have no better teaching." The Duke smiled. He got up, opened a bookcase, took out Las Casas Memorial and Montholon's books, and put them on his desk. "I am never without these books," he said, "and at Schönbrunn I have a whole library full of works about my father, but they contain only a record of the past." What about the present? What do people think about me in France? Have I still partisans? I should have to be sure of a strong footing there. And what would be Europe's attitude towards me? Prokesh tried to curb his youthful anxiety, made all the worse by his impatience. "In a few days," he said, "I have to set off on a long journey through Switzerland and Germany. I shall inform myself about the attitude of public opinion towards you, and let you know when I get back." "Ah, my friend," cried the Duke, "how can I thank you? Let us hope that your report will not be a disappointment. Perhaps people regard me as a nonentity. They may think that I have denied my birth, but you'll undeceive anybody who says anything like that to you, won't you? You'll tell people the truth, won't you? I promise you that, everywhere I go, people shall learn the true likeness of Napoleon's son." At this point the Duke approached Prokesh, who was sitting down, and put his 2 hands on his shoulders. "Prokesh, my friend Prokesh," he said, "my future is taking shape. You think so too, don't you? And it is just at this moment that you talk about leaving me. But you are not alone, Prince. You are surrounded by people of proven devotion to you. Besides, there is the imperial family." The Duke shook his fair head and cast his eyes up to heaven. "How little you know them, Prokesh. They ooze boredom, melancholy, and selfishness. I have never felt at home among them. Oh, those luncheons at the imperial table! Oh, the conversation one has to carry on there! Conversation in working class, eating houses, must be more intelligent. My uncles, my aunts, and my cousins are narrow-minded and petty. Among them only the Archduke John deserves unreserved esteem. He is a big-hearted man. My grandfather is fond of me, to be sure, and he is fair and well-meaning, but he is dominated by Metternich, who does what he likes with him. The Empress has brains, but her heart is dried up. The Crown Prince is feeble-minded, and his brother Francis Charles is ill-natured, shifty, and paltry." "Then is there nobody you like?" Franz blushed slightly. "Yes, there is the Archduchess Sophie. She is the only person who understands me. Her affection is my sole comfort. She is so sweet, so kind, Prokesh. I was an abandoned child, and she warmed my heart to life again." Prokesh sought to probe his friend's feelings. "She is very dear to you, the Archduchess Sophie. We were born to understand each other. She and you, Prokesh, are the only people in the world whom I have ever taken into my confidence. So, my friend, you can't desert me now. I need you. You must agree to become a member of my military household. I shall ask my mother to use her influence to secure your appointment. But I have no right to claim such an honor, Prince. It isn't a question of honor. It's a question of your doing me a great service. Everybody is bent on keeping me in a subordinate position. You won't refuse to help me, Prokesh." Of course not, Prince. My devotion is all yours. I need a trusty counselor. In Schiller's play, Don Carlos, the prince has a confidant, the Marquis de Posa, who guides him, assists him, and supports him in his troubles. Prokesh, will you be my Posa? Prokesh drew back a step. His face went stern. You are a young man, not yet 20. Have you made up your mind fully, firmly? Can I trust you, Prince? You have a great task before you, and I do not know you yet. The Duke turned pale. His eyes filled with tears. That is true. I have done nothing yet to deserve your esteem, your confidence in me. Ah, if only you could look inside me. For whatever reason, one may be exiled from one's native land. No reason is strong enough to make one forget it. No, I have not forgotten the place where I was born, nor have I forgotten the spot where my father's body rots. Put me to the test. You will find that I am indeed Napoleon's son. Have faith in my star. He spoke with wounded pride. The doubt which Prokesh's words had cast upon him seemed to inflict a pain he did not deserve. His emotion swept away Prokesh's last scruples. Very well, Prince, he said. I will be your Posa, but you must never be as weak as Don Carlos. I agree to be your man, but on 2 conditions. Prokesh paused. The Duke held his breath as he listened, stressing his words. Prokesh wound up. On 2 conditions. 1, that it is for life. The other, that yours shall be a great life. The 2 of them stood face to face, with shining eyes. Prokesh opened his arms, and Franz flung himself into them, sobbing for joy. So their hearts gave themselves to one another. On June 30th, Prokesh came to say goodbye to the Duke of Reichstadt. They talked together for a long time. When they parted, they embraced, and Prokesh presented his friend with a medallion of Alexander the Great. Franz placed it over his heart as a talisman, side by side with a blessed medallion which Sophie had given him. Chapter 46. Summons from France. The open French window of the drawing-room gave directly on to a terrace overlooking the park of Baden, planted with lime trees and pines. The August sun sketched striking designs on the shaded paths, and the air smelt of warm resin. Marie-Louise was in conversation with de Tristan. She wore a gown of rose muslin. She was fatter than ever, and makeup and corset ill concealed her body's premature degeneration. How do you find my son, de Tristan? You may speak frankly. We are alone. He still coughs a little, madame, but he is better. I think that Malfatti, his new doctor, treats him more intelligently than poor Stodenheim, whom we lost in the month of May. He diagnoses an affliction of the skin, and thinks that the Duke's liver is out of order. He treats him accordingly. Baths, a very strict diet, and no fatigue. And that meant postponing his entrance into the army for 6 months. You know, my friend, I feel that he'll never forgive us for that. Ah, madame, It is hard to tell what he thinks." Marie-Louise sighed. She went on. "He has changed, towards me very much. I can scarcely recognize him any more. He isn't at all like other young men of his age. Since we've been here in Baden, I haven't heard him laugh once, and he has no taste for anything. I tried in vain to interest him in Dr. Roulette's collection of butterflies. Is there anything in the world prettier than butterflies? But he has just looked at them with absent eyes. What does he want? He has just been appointed major in Solon's regiment. He has a fine career before him. He aspires higher, no doubt. He dreams. Has he taken you into his confidence?" "No, but I know that he is following the course of events in France very closely." "What has he taken into his head now, as though there could be any better position than that of an Austrian prince?" "I have it. Suppose he has some little love affair in hand. He's just at the age when the heart awakens." De Tristan shook his head. "No, it's not that, madame. I keep an eye on him. I have followed him. Every day he goes for a ride on horseback. He heads for Hellenthal. He rides like a madman, leaning forward over the horse's neck, with his hair streaming in the wind, always at a gallop. He plunges into the woods. At the end of a league or two, he dismounts, and sits down at the foot of a tree. He stays there for hours at a time without stirring. He doesn't read. He doesn't do anything. He just broods." "What about?" The tutor hesitated before he replied. Finally, in a low voice, he said, "His father's memory haunts him. It's an ill for which there is no cure." Marie-Louise shivered. She threw a gauze scarf over her shoulders, as though an icy wind had fallen upon her. "That will do," she said, in a hollow voice. "I have no desire to live over again with the son what I endured with the father." De Tristan promptly passed on to another subject. "The Duke has many virtues, but he also has certain failings, which for his own good I persist in trying to correct. To tell the truth, they are weaknesses and whims rather than anything else. For example, he cultivates popularity to excess. When he is out riding in the Prater, he loves impressing the Viennese with his horsemanship. He is proud when people cheer him. For another thing, I find him too familiar both with his inferiors and his equals. He shakes hands with everybody. He forgets his rank. I'm told it's an English fashion. One of these days he'll get a flea in his ear." Marie-Louise jumped. "What did you say?" "I beg your pardon," stammered de Tristan. At this moment, the shouts and laughter of children rang out on the terrace. The door opened, and half a dozen boys and girls came into the drawing-room. They were all ages, from 5 to 14. "Isn't Cousin Franz back yet, Aunt?" asked one of them. "Not yet, children. But he promised us he'd be back for tea," said a little archduchess, in a peremptory tone. "I don't expect he'll be long. Wait a little for him." The children started amusing themselves all over the drawing-room. They surrounded the parrot and frightened it into loud squawks on its perch. They teased the little dog asleep on a cushion. The air rang with discords, struck on the harp and the piano. Marie-Louise put her hands to her ears. "Will you keep quiet? Charles, Margarita will bite you in a minute and serve you right. John, don't pull Lovely's tail. Amelia, leave the harp alone. You're just like a lot of little brigands." All at once a shout went up. "Here he is! Here's Cousin Franz!" All the children rushed to meet the Duke. He came forward slowly, with a riding crop in his hand, his head down, and his tall figure a bit bent. He wore white breeches and a dark coat, fitting closely at the waist. His high black cravat set off the pallor of his face. Mechanically he pushed back the fair curls, tumbling about his brow. The children surrounded him and escorted him into the drawing-room in triumph. "Good afternoon, Mother," he said, bending over to kiss Marie-Louise. She looked up at him. "Why, you're soaking wet, my dear boy. I suppose you've been galloping like a madman again. Aren't you ever going to learn sense? You ought to change your clothes. If you stay like that, you may catch cold and make yourself ill." "Not much chance of that in this heat, Mother." He sat down, and the younger archdukes lost no time in climbing up on his knees. He kissed them and caressed them, finding amusement in their laughter and their play. Like his father, he was fond of children, and liked to see them having a good time. The two eldest archduchesses kept in the background, never taking their eyes off Franz. They were pale and emotional. "Isn't he handsome?" said one of them. "Nobody else wears such elegant cravats. What I like best about him are his beautifully pointed nails. They're just like a Chinaman's. And aren't his hands white?" "I keep his portrait in my prayer book," whispered the first. "I wish Mass lasted all day." The other drew herself up proudly. "I've got his portrait too, but I keep it under my pillow and go to sleep with it. That's much better." The Duke turned to Marie-Louise. "You won't forget about my friend Prakash, Mother, will you? Can I count on you to recommend him to the Emperor again?" "Certainly, my boy. I'll speak to him again this evening. We must get Metternich's consent at all cost. If I can't have Prakash, I feel that I shall remain non-entity all my life. I shall never succeed in anything. Don't get excited," de Tristan intervened. The Duke pulled a snuff-box out of his pocket and took a pinch. "Oh," exclaimed Marie-Louise, "have you started taking snuff now? Why, it's a disgusting habit." Franz looked his mother straight in the eyes. "He took snuff, didn't he? So far as I remember, he had a whole collection of snuff-boxes. For that matter, he left them to me in his will. Where are they?" He paused, then went on, with bitter sarcasm. "If I never got them, I suppose it was for the sake of sparing me a disgusting habit." There was a silence. Marie-Louise looked away in embarrassment, and cast about for another subject of conversation. All at once she caught sight of Countess Scarampi, her lady-in-waiting, coming along the terrace towards the drawing-room. "Ah, here's our dear Countess," she said. Chapter 47. Napoleon. Metternich was at his castle of Königswert in Bohemia when he heard the news of the July Revolution in France. It sent him into a fainting fit, and his doctor had to be summoned. "All my life's work is collapsing," he groaned, when he recovered consciousness. He unburdened himself in invective against France, that abscess in Europe, against Charles X, that old fool, against Polignac, that fatuous fop. Then he proceeded to consider the situation. It was serious. In Paris the army and the populace were ready to acclaim Napoleon II. The stage, posters, pictures, and popular songs made him the man of the hour. If young Napoleon presents himself at the frontier before the end of the month, people said, he will sleep in the Tuileries as emperor. The mere idea gave Metternich a cold sweat. Had he spent 15 years of effort, of guile, of plotting, only to reach this result? Who would succeed Charles X? The Duc de Bordeaux, one of the Orleans family, or Napoleon II? Ah no, rather than that, Metternich would strangle young Napoleon with his own hands. Anxiously the Chancellor followed the progress of events in France. Oh, what a relief! For lack of a leader, from the outset the Bonapartists were divided. Some of them rallied to the Orleanists, others to the Republicans. Lafayette completed the spoiling of the Bonapartists. On August 7, 1830, the Duc d'Orléans was proclaimed King of the French under the title of Louis Philippe. Metternich breathed a little more easily. The game was far from being lost. The Duc d'Orléans was only keeping the throne warm for the Bourbon Clément, Henry V. To frighten him, Austria need merely brandish the Duke of Reichstadt as a scarecrow in the distance. Metternich conveyed word to the King of the Barricades, as Louis Philippe was contemptuously called, that he had better abate his fever and forego his revolutionary propaganda. Otherwise the eaglet would be turned into the eagle and let loose on his dappled fleece. The warning bore fruit. In Vienna, Napoleon's son waited in vain for any word, any sign, any hint which would enable him to believe that France was thinking about him. Every day that passed bore away a little more of his hopes. He heard nothing. He was plunged into a darkness, lit by no star. At the end of August, Prokesh arrived at Schönbrunn, coming from Zurich. The two friends fell into one another's arms. Then the prince questioned the traveler eagerly. "Tell me, what are people saying about me in Europe? Do they really believe that I am a kind of Minus Bobbins, as legend would have it?" "You need have no fear of that," replied Prokesh. "Everywhere in Germany I found the deepest sympathy for you. Generally speaking, you are looked upon as the coming master of France." "Am I really? But Prokesh, if you only knew how. I sometimes tremble at the idea of ascending the throne. You're not on it yet, Prince, but sooner or later Louis Philippe will fall. Meanwhile, strengthen your will, widen your knowledge." Franz seized his friend's hand. Sadly, sorrowfully, he said, "Ah, how your presence, Your advice would have helped me in that task, but you are not to belong to my military household, as I hoped." Metternich refused my mother's request. "I need Prakash for myself," he declared. The Duke paused. He clenched his fist. "But a time will come when my will shall prevail." His excitement increased to such a point that it alarmed his entourage. It was decided to calm him down. On September 4th, 1830, at the castle of Nikolsburg, he was brought face to face with Prince de Tristan, his tutor's brother, who had made a long stay in France during the past few years. Their conversation lasted 2 hours. It left the Duke very much downcast. Prince de Tristan had painted the situation in France in the blackest colors. According to him, the number of Bonapartists was decreasing from day to day. The people demanded only liberty, equality, and peace, and these things the new regime promised them. Napoleon, too, had been popular under Louis XVIII and Charles X. Now, under Louis Philippe, he was nothing more than the Duke of Reichstadt, an Austrian prince. Some days later, the Duke set off, with the whole court, for Hungary, to attend the coronation of the Crown Prince at Pressburg. His stay in Hungary lasted several weeks, and he did not return to Schönbrunn until the beginning of October. Meanwhile, following the example of the French, the Belgians had revolted against Holland. On October 4th, they proclaimed their independence. They were in search of a king. They contemplated offering the crown to the Duke of Reichstadt. The Duke's hopes rose again, but Metternich lost no time in dashing them to the ground. "No," he decreed. "No, once and for all. He shall never sit on any throne." On October 22nd, 1830, a mysterious personage in a modest coach arrived at the White Swan Inn, at the corner of the Malmarkt in Vienna. She was a lady, accompanied by only one maid. She declared that her name was Countess Camerata, and that she came from Trieste. She was about 25, and very beautiful. Everybody admired her broad brow, her deep-set glowing eyes, the clear-cut shape of her mouth, the mature perfection of her figure. The traveler's strange behavior soon aroused the innkeeper's anxiety. He was relieved to learn that the police had their eye on her. On the morrow of her arrival, the Countess went and posted herself at the crossroads at Spinneren am Kreuz, where Marie-Louise, who was on her way back to Parma, would pass. She succeeded in approaching Marie-Louise, and whispering a few words to her. Nobody heard what she said. After this, she went out morning and evening. She was to be seen at the Burgtheater, in the Prater, on the ramparts, every place where the Duke of Reichstadt showed himself in public. Obviously she was watching for an opportunity to approach the prince and speak to him, but he was always accompanied by somebody. Either Foresti or Abanas, or one of the officers of his regiment. From a distance, she devoured him with her eyes, and sighed in dismay at the expression of unhappiness stamped upon his face. On November 14th, posted opposite the Hofburg, the Countess waited patiently for the Duke to come out. She was wearing a big Scotch plaid in which she could hide her face. Night was falling, and it was raining. All at once she gave a start. It was he, and by an unexpected chance he was alone. She followed him. Where was he going? Probably to Abanas' house, which was close to the palace. She ran to catch up with him, for his long legs were carrying him along quickly. She overtook him, and he reached his tutor's door. She laid her hand authoritatively on his arm. The Duke turned around. "Who are you, madame?" She flung back her hood and disclosed her face. The lamp burning at the top of the steps lit it up clearly. The Duke was dumbfounded. In a flash his father's face seemed to have appeared before him. At this moment the door opened. It was Abanas. As he caught sight of the couple, his suspicions were aroused. "What are you doing here, madame?" he asked, sternly. The Countess drew herself up. "Who shall forbid me to kiss the hand of my sovereign son?" she asked. Before Abanas could interfere, she suited her action to her words. Then she vanished into the night. Trembling all over, the Duke walked up the steps and entered the house. "Who is that creature?" demanded Abanas. "I imagine," replied the Duke, thoughtfully, "that she must be my cousin, Countess Napoleon Camerata. She was the daughter of Elisa Bacciacchi, Napoleon's sister. As early as the age of 5, she was a promising child. One day Napoleon let her have lunch with him, and put her sitting opposite him. Suddenly, with a frown, he said, 'What's this I hear about you, mademoiselle? You wet your bed last night, didn't you?' The little girl drew herself up as stiff as a post, and replied with a fine air of offended dignity, 'If you can only talk about such silly things, uncle, I'm going away.' Since then her character had become stronger all the time. Married in 1825 to Count Philippe Camerata, she had a son by him in the following year, but since then she had lived apart from him. She was regarded by her family as a bit eccentric, a dreamer of dreams, of romance and epic. She spent half her days on horseback, to the great scandalization of her relations. She delighted in wearing men's kit and riding astride. Mounted on the most stubborn stallions, she bred dogs, shot with gun and pistol, and fenced, handling her weapon like a professional duelist. The great dream of her life was to see her cousin ascend his father's throne. All by herself she set about making this dream come true. She proposed to play the role of the angel announcing that the time was at hand. Some months earlier, at Baden, she had met the Duke while they were both out driving. She leant out of a window and shouted at him, "Aren't you ashamed to wear Austrian uniform?" But the noise of the wheels had drowned out her indignant question. On November 24th, when Prakash paid a visit to Franz, he found him much excited. "Read this letter," said the Duke, handing a sheet of paper to his friend. With astonishment, Prakash read the following letter: "Vienna, November 17th, 1830. Prince, I am writing to you for the 3rd time. Be good enough to let me have a word to say whether you received my earlier letters. I write to ask you whether you mean to act as an Austrian Archduke or as a French prince. In the former case, hand my letters over to the authorities. By undoing me, you will doubtless improve your own position, and your act of devotion will redound to your credit. You can have no hope except in yourself. In the name of the terrible suffering to which the kings of Europe condemned your father, think of his death in exile, by which they made him expiate the crime of having been only too generous to them. Remember that you are his son, and that his dying eyes rested on your portrait. Let all this horror sink into you, and then inflict upon the kings of Europe simply the punishment of seeing you seated on the throne of France. Take advantage of this moment. Prince, perhaps I have said too much. My fate is in your hands. I may tell you that, if you make use of my letters in order to undo me, I shall suffer more from the thought of your cowardice than from anything that may be done to me. The man who delivers this letter to you may be trusted with your answer. If you have any honor, you will not refuse me one. Napoleon Ch45. What do you think of that, my friend? Asked the Duke, when Prokesh had finished reading the letter. I think that this letter was written by an eccentric. By the way, who brought it to you? Albanos's servant. It strikes me as a queer business, Prince. Have you any ideas about it? I think, said the Duke, that the very first thing is to fathom my cousin's intentions. Who sent her? Has she come on behalf of Napoleon's family, on behalf of my partisans in France, or on her own account? To tell you the truth, she inspires me with no great confidence. My father was undone by her family, and I have no desire to be a second victim of the Bonapartes. Besides, the medium through which the letter reached me is suspicious, to say the least of it. Prokesh studied the letter thoughtfully. Have you noticed, he asked, that it is dated November 17th, but it did not reach you until the 24th. Isn't that odd? Where are the other two letters? I never received them. Prokesh had a shrewd look on his face. He snapped his fingers. What if all this is just a trick of Metternich's to put you to the test? Albanos's servant may be in the pay of the police. The Duke turned pale. His doubts turned suddenly into certainty. I expect you're right, he said. It would be very rash of me to commit myself in this matter. Tomorrow I shall show the letter to the Emperor, but I shall ask him for his word of honor that the Countess shall not be molested in any way. At the same time, it went hard with the Duke rudely to repel an overture from a member of his own family, even though she offered him no help in stabilizing his future, even though she struck him as a bit crazy. The Countess was at least well-intentioned towards him. On November 29th, he asked Prokesh, "Will you give me your word of honor that I may count upon you in any circumstances?" Prokesh did not hesitate. "I give you my word. I am engaged to be married, and I love my fiancée dearly, but I beg you to make whatever use of me you may wish." Friendship carried to such a point of self-sacrifice is rare. "What I want you to do," said Franz, "is to go and see my cousin, explain to her why I must adopt an attitude of reserve. I should not like her to misunderstand my reasons for being prudent. Prakash went to the White Swan Inn the very same day. The Countess received him somewhat distrustfully, but he was soon able to reassure her. He told her that Franz was far from forgetting his birth. He was wrapped up in his father's history. It nurtured all his plans, all his dreams. By skillfully questioning, Prakash discovered that the Countess had received no mandate from anybody to act as she had done. She had simply taken it into her head. When Prakash took leave of her, she shook hands with him most cordially. A week or two later, she left Vienna, never to return. It was a month later. One evening in December, Prakash went into the Duke's study and looked round for his friend. He caught sight of him asleep in an armchair, with a book open on his knees. Prakash went over to the prince and gazed at him for some little time. The spectacle before him gave him a frightful clutch at the heart. How pale the prince was! In his surrender to sleep, he looked thinner than ever, more frail than ever, as though death had suddenly drawn near to him. The dark rims round his eyes ate into his face. His breath came short and panting between his dry lips. His hands hung limp, the color of wax. Franz opened his eyes and sat up. "Oh, it's you, my friend. I am so glad to see you. I felt so lonely this evening. I had no taste for anything. But now that I see you, all my courage comes back to me." His eyes shone too brightly as he spoke, and he had to interrupt himself while he coughed. When he got his breath again, he anticipated Prakash's question. "You needn't be alarmed. It's only a cold. I shall be all right again in a few days." Prakash took hold of his hands. "Why, you're in a fever. Ah, Franz, why won't you take better care of yourself? You're always doing silly things. You ride your horses to death every day. Then you go to the opera without even changing your underclothes, in cold weather like this. Then you go to a ball and to supper. When you get home, instead of going to bed, you drink 1 cup of coffee after another, and sit up till dawn. Is that reasonable?" The Duke hung his head shamefaced. "Don't scold me too much. De Tristan and Dr. Malfatti, who are responsible for your health, aren't at all pleased with you, and who can say that they are wrong? You refuse to take care of yourself. You do still worse. You go against all the advice that they give you. Why will you persist in asking from your brain and your body more than they can stand?" In a low voice, the Duke murmured, "Prakash, during the last few months, I have seen all my dreams shattered one by one. First France escaped me, then Belgium, and now I am being robbed of the crown of Poland in its turn. Yet I still have in my ears what my grandfather said to me at Pressburg last September. If the French people want you, and if the Allies consent, I shall raise no objection to your ascending the throne of France." Did he mean it, or was he just lying to me out of kindness? Ah, my friend, what forces I have arrayed against me! Who is to tell me whether anybody in France still thinks about me, whether I have any friends in the world who work for the triumph of my cause. While the prince became more and more excited, in the darkness amid which his friend struggled, Prakash caught a glimpse of the impenetrable face of Metternich, like a spider lurking in the middle of its web. Alas, Austria had done only too well in building up a wall of silence around Napoleon's son. During the past 13 years, almost every year, the Bonapartists had tried to hatch conspiracies all over the country, in Bordeaux and Lyons, in 1817, in Paris in 1820, in Belfort, Saumur, and Metz in 1822, in Colmar, and on the Bedossus in 1823. They had endeavored to raise the army in rebellion in the hope of restoring Napoleon II to his father's throne. But all these attempts had failed. Every time, after trials that aroused the utmost excitement, sentences of death had decimated the conspirators, though without daunting their courage. Meanwhile, no echo of these tragedies, not even the echo of the firing squads, had reached the ears of the Duke of Reichstadt. Then quite recently, at the beginning of November, Napoleon's brother Joseph, who had settled at Point Breeze in the United States, had sent letters to Metternich and the Austrian Emperor through the medium of Foch's son. He had asked that he should be entrusted with his nephew. If he appeared alone in France in a tricolor scarf, he wrote, Napoleon II would be proclaimed emperor, but Joseph received no reply to his letters. At about the same time, Lucien Bonaparte made a similar overture. He was no luckier. Montholon failed in his turn. The Duke of Reichstadt never had any knowledge of these endeavors. The volume over which he had fallen asleep slid to the ground. The prince picked it up. It was Antimarchi's Memoirs. Of itself, the book opened at Napoleon's will. Franz closed his eyes. He recited the fourth clause as though it were a prayer. I beg my son never to forget that he was born a French prince, and never to lend himself to being a tool on the hands of the triumvirs who oppress the peoples of Europe. He must never fight against France, or do anything to harm France. He must adopt my motto, everything for the French people. He paused for breath. Then he said to Prakash, fervently, that is my breviary, my rule of life. Yes, whatever happens, I shall always remain a French prince. I shall fulfill my destiny. Prakash looked at him reproachfully. Don't look at me like that, cried the Duke. I know what you are thinking. You are contemplating the possibility of a war between France and Austria, aren't you? You needn't remind me that such a war would put me in a heart-rending position. I don't believe it will ever happen. I don't want to have to make such a choice. But if it comes to that point, my choice is made already. I know beforehand that my Bonaparte blood would speak louder than my Habsburg blood. The other day, at Schönbrunn, 2 Prussian officers wanted to see me. I refused to receive them. Two of Blucher's fellow countrymen, ah no, I passed by them in the ante-room without saluting them. Ah, Prakash, you are so wise. Tell me how much longer must I wait? Patience, Franz. Go on making yourself ready. It is still nearly 2 years before you come of age. Where shall I be in 2 years? The Duke looked down at his uniform. He said bitterly, I've been appointed lieutenant colonel in Nassau's regiment. Doubtless my uniform will never see fire, but in my will I shall demand that my coffin shall be carried into the first battle, so that my bones may have the consolation of hearing around them the whistle of bullets for which I have so often longed. Prakash smiled at the extravagance of his language. Don't get beside yourself, Franz. Keep as calm as your father always was on the eve of battle. Meanwhile, we will work together. I shall teach you to be patient, to be strong. Franz flung himself weeping into his friend's arms. You are the only man I can trust. What would become of me without you? Don't desert me. You are my one friend. Prakash consoled him. The Duke reminded him of a bird trying his wings, and after several heavy falls, doubting whether it will ever fly.